This summer we've been going through the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are something that get referenced a lot, not just in scripture, but in pop culture also. But it isn't as often that we take the time to really dive in deep to what their themes might mean for us today. How can we faithfully live into the Ten Commandments in our 21st century lives? We're now halfway through our exploration of the Ten Commandments, which brings us to number 5. Honor your father and your mother, so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. But before we dig into that commandment or today's gospel story, I wanted to read you a fairy tale from the pulpit, as one does, especially when one is me. Technically, there are a lot of stories recorded by the Grimm brothers that don't have any magical elements or even princesses, but this particular story is in the same book as Rapunzel and the 12 Dancing Princesses, so I'm still calling it a fairy tale, gosh darn it. Anyway, this is the story of the old man and his grandson, as translated by Edgar Taylor and Marion Edwards in the 19th century. I love things that are in the public domain. Once upon a time. There was once a very old man, whose eyes had become dim, his ears dull of hearing, his knees trembled, and when he sat at table he could hardly hold the spoon, and spilt the broth upon the tablecloth or let it run out of his mouth. His son and his son's wife were disgusted at this, so the old grandfather at last had to sit in the corner behind the stove, and they gave him his food in an earthenware bowl, and not even enough of it. And he used to look towards the table with his eyes full of tears. Once, too, his trembling hands could not hold the bowl, and it fell to the ground and broke. The young wife scolded him, but he said nothing and only sighed. Then they brought him a wooden bowl that they had bought for a few halfpence, out of which he had to eat. They were once sitting thus, when the little grandson of 4 years old began to gather together some bits of wood upon the ground. "What are you doing there?" asked the father. "I am making a little trough," answered the child, "for father and mother to eat out of when I am big." The man and his wife looked at each other for a while, and presently began to cry. Then they took the old grandfather to the table, and henceforth always let him eat with them, and likewise said nothing if he did spill a little of something. Did any of them live happily ever after? I like to think so. I've been told that this is a really depressing story. I'm told that a lot about things that I like. And I'll grant that it isn't exactly a comedy, but I think it's a really touching illustration of how beautiful it can be when someone admits that they have been wrong. The man and his wife could have doubled down on how they treated the old grandfather, acted like any of the evil stepmothers in the other stories, but they don't. They choose to be kinder from that day forward and to treat the old grandfather with honor and dignity. So our third reading, our second scripture reading this morning, comes to us from the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 12, verses 46 through 50. Hear now the word of the Lord. While Jesus was still speaking to the crowds, his mother and his brothers were standing outside wanting to speak to him. Someone told Jesus, "Look, your mother and brothers are standing outside wanting to speak to you." But to the one who had told him this, Jesus replied, "Who is my mother, and who are my brothers?" And pointing to his disciples, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Within the Ten Commandments that Moses brought down from God, we are given this instruction: honor your father and your mother, so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. But Jesus asks, who is my mother, and who are my brothers? When we hear the words father and mother, what probably first comes to mind is the idea of a singular biological mother and a singular biological father. But the terms in Hebrew, while they absolutely can refer to literal biological parents, can also refer to parents in a more general sense, like your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, etc., or to the entirety of ancestors who have gone before you within your own family, aunts and uncles included, or to all the elders living within your tribe to whom you might owe honor and respect, whether or not they are your close blood relations. There is a theme of chosen family that runs deep throughout the narrative of Jesus' life. Joseph chooses to stay with Mary, even though it may alienate him from some of his family or peers. Jesus chooses to stay behind in the temple for several days as a child and reminds Mary and Joseph that they are not the only parents to whom he might owe honor and respect. As Jesus grows up, he chooses to welcome men and women from different backgrounds and walks of life to eat with him, to learn from him, and to travel with him. He does not limit himself to the company of his cousins or even to the company of the community he was born into, at least not exclusively. Who is my mother, and who are my brothers? In the ancient Roman world, there was an understanding that everything belonged to a father who was the head of his household. I would love to think that this misogynist tradition of the Roman paterfamilias was an archaic concept that we have evolved past in our modern society, but have we? Needless to say, it's reasonable to feel discomfort with a commandment that could be heard in some contexts as honor the man who essentially owns you and controls your life. Anyway, this is why we need feminism, smash the patriarchy. The fifth commandment urges us to honor our father and our mother. In the ancient Roman world that Jesus lived in, it might have been easy to receive that commandment and hear, give honor to the head of your family because they are more powerful than you and because you owe it to them. I don't think that is how God ever intended this commandment to be heard. But in a society with a rigid social structure and a rigid sense of family hierarchy, I think it would be easy to hear it that way. So Jesus asks, who is my mother and who are my brothers? Because in the new community that Jesus is forming, the way that the first generations of believers will follow, the kingdom of heaven that we are building together on earth, there is no paterfamilias, no hierarchical structure in which a single person has control over their family, because the only head is God. Jesus pushes back against the social norms of his day and tells us to care for and give honor not just to the paterfamilias, not just to the elders who are more powerful than us, because we owe it to them, but to the elders who are less powerful than us, because they are the ones who need it. Who is my mother, and who are my brothers? Jesus is redefining family to include not just the people in your family of origin, but the people in your chosen family, the people you're sitting with now, the people whom you honor and care for not because you feel obligated to, but because you love them. Who is my mother, and who are my brothers? Jesus asks. Jesus asks a lot of rhetorical questions, but this isn't quite one of them. Who are his mother and his brothers? He gives an answer, and that answer is basically yes. The fifth commandment urges us to honor our father and our mother. But Jesus essentially says, great, awesome, yes, do that. But just to be clear, I don't mean honor just two people. I mean, honor everyone within your community who deserves honor. Care for everyone within your community who needs to be cared for. After all, at numerous points throughout Scripture, we are urged to remember to take care of the poor, the widow, and the orphan. If someone is alone, who is left to honor them? Who is my mother, and who are my brothers? Jesus asks. The poor, the widow, and the orphan, they are his mother and his brothers, and ours too. After all, when Jesus reminds us to love our neighbors only to get sassed back with the cheeky question, yeah, but who is my neighbor anyway? Jesus sighs and tells a story about how our neighbors aren't just the people we live near and the people who are like us. Who is your neighbor? Yes. Everyone is your neighbor, even those Samaritan people, even that weird sheep, even the guy in the apartment below yours who plays the flute badly at all hours of the night. If you are told to love your neighbor, and you look for a loophole by asking, okay, but who is my neighbor, and perhaps more specifically, who is not my neighbor, then the answer is, yes, you are called to love your neighbor, and yes, everyone is your neighbor, and yes, that does mean that you are called to love everyone, no exceptions. The fifth commandment says, honor your parents. In a time before Social Security, retirement communities, or hospice care, that commandment meant that God did not want us to leave people to die alone after they stopped contributing to our households. The previous commandment tells us that not only should we ourselves rest on the Sabbath day, but we should also provide the opportunity for our communities, our livestock, and even the land itself to rest. God made us and loved us and called us not just good, but very good. Not for what we can do, but for who we are. The fifth commandment can be read as an extension of the fourth commandment about resting on the Sabbath day. There will come a time when the older members of your community will not be able to continue working 6 days a week. Honor them by letting them live into a longer Sabbath than just one day. The commandment to honor your father and your mother is often taught to kids as something more like obey your parents and do what they tell you, and less like take care of older people who can no longer work. Honor and obey are pretty different concepts, but I would imagine that a kid is more likely to understand the concept of respect your grown-ups by listening to them, rather than respect the elders of your community by finding ways to care for them when they are no longer able to work and when they become less able to take care of themselves. Different people have different needs, and it isn't always possible for us to care for older family members at home. Even so, Jesus calls us to treat people with dignity and respect, not just one's own biological family, not just the head of your family who has more power than you do, not just the people who can offer you something, not just the people to whom you feel obligated. Jesus invites us to become his own sisters and brothers, beloved children of God in the new kingdom of heaven that we are building together here on earth. It's a radical redefinition of family, but to choose to follow Jesus is to radically redefine yourself. You have heard it said that we must honor our fathers and mothers. But Jesus says to us, whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and my sister and my mother. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.